When you think of medieval Europe, you probably imagine knights, castles, or great cathedrals. But behind all of that, ordinary people were simply trying to eat. In the cold fields of the north, survival often came down to a single grain rye. Dark, plain, and sometimes even dangerous, it was the bread that kept entire villages alive through freezing winters. Tonight, we'll slow down and explore how medieval farmers coaxed food from frozen ground, one harvest at a time. Stay with me until the end, and you'll see how something as ordinary as bread quietly shaped the history of Europe. Section 1. Fields of Cold Earth. When you imagine farming, perhaps you think of golden fields, a warm sun, and a growing season that stretches with abundance. But medieval farmers in northern Europe did not live with such reassurance. Instead, they lived on the margins of cold, in climates where the growing season was as short as 4 months, and where one unexpected frost could undo months of backbreaking work. Their task was not simply to grow food, but to coax it from an environment that seemed, at times, hostile to human survival. Imagine the wide plains of northern Germany or the rolling landscapes of Scandinavia around the year 1100. The winters were long, with snow blanketing the ground for weeks, sometimes months. The soil would harden under frost, unyielding to even the sharpest plow. When the thaw finally arrived in spring, it was not the soft warmth of southern lands but a damp chill. Mud clinging to boots and oxen hooves, water pooling in furrows, and winds that carried the last remnants of winter's bite. And yet, despite this, farmers managed to grow rye, oats, barley, and in some areas, hardy forms of wheat. The soil was rarely fertile without effort. Medieval accounts and even archaeology remind us of how thin and acidic much of northern Europe's land could be. Heavy clay soil needed to be broken by plowing teams, sometimes of 8 oxen, an enormous resource investment. Poor sandy soil demanded constant amendment with manure or ashes. Without careful tending, crops would fail. Yet failure was not an option. A single bad harvest might mean hunger for the winter and spring known grimly as the lean season. When old stores ran low but new crops had yet to ripen, rye became the grain of survival. Unlike wheat, which demanded more warmth and better soil, rye tolerated cold and could grow even in poor conditions. It was sown in the autumn, sprouted briefly before the snows, and then slept under the frost until spring returned. This gave it a head start, maturing early enough to provide food before the summer was over. Rye bread, dense and dark, was not considered elegant by wealthier classes, but for the majority of medieval peasants across Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia, it was daily sustenance. The fact that rye could resist both cold and disease made it a reliable crop when others faltered, but rye carried risks of its own. In damp years, the fungus Claviceps purpurea ergot could infest the grain, replacing kernels with dark, poisonous sclerotia. When milled into bread, it caused convulsions, hallucinations, or even death. Records from monasteries in the Rhineland and towns along the Baltic mention waves of illness, often attributed to the burning sickness, which we now recognize as ergotism. Yet, the people had little choice. They learned over time to recognize the worst infestations, to separate the tainted kernels when possible. But hunger often overruled caution. The cycle of labor in these climates was monotonous, but it was precise, dictated by the short window of growing time. In March or April, when the ground softened, fields were plowed. The open field system dominated much of northern Europe. Instead of individual fenced plots, peasants farmed in great strips of land, scattered throughout shared fields. A man might own 3 strips, his neighbor 6, all interspersed like a woven cloth. This ensured fairness, as each farmer shared both the fertile and less fertile soils of the village's domain. But it also meant constant cooperation, for plowing and planting had to be coordinated, and the oxen teams were often pooled among households. By May, the rye and barley were up, fragile green shoots standing against winds that could still carry frost. Summer was short, but it was busy. Weeding was constant, often by hand, since weeds thrived in the same conditions as the crops. Fallow fields were grazed by livestock, whose manure was both nourishment and necessity for the coming years. By July or August, harvest began, and every hand was needed. The work was grueling but swift. A storm could flatten the stalks and rot them before they were brought in. Villages often harvested communally, moving strip by strip, with women and children gathering the sheaves, men cutting with sickles, and carts hauling to barns. Preservation mattered as much as growth. In freezing climates, food could not be eaten fresh alone. Grain was stored in pits, barns, or granaries, but dampness threatened rot and pests. Careful layering of straw helped absorb moisture. Rodents had to be kept out with raised platforms or stone foundations. The rhythm was repetitive: grow, harvest, store, ration, and hope that the stores would last until the next summer. As the climate cooled in what historians call the Little Ice Age, beginning around the 14th century, these challenges deepened. Earlier frosts shortened seasons further. Accounts describe harvests delayed until September, when rains made cutting miserable and yields were meager. Yet medieval farmers adapted in small but important ways. They shifted to hardier grains. They grew turnips and cabbages in garden plots, crops that withstood frost better than delicate vegetables. In some places, they even brewed beer from oats when barley grew scarce, showing that survival required flexibility, not just tradition. It is worth pausing to consider just how much mental and physical effort this demanded. Today, food systems operate invisibly for most of us. But in medieval Northern Europe, each household measured its survival in sacks of grain, bundles of straw, and the careful reckoning of how many mouths could be fed from how much rye bread. Behind the image of knights, castles, and cathedrals lay the quiet reality that if rye did not sprout, if a frost came too soon, or if ergot poisoned the bread, an entire village might be thrust into hunger. So you find yourself in a damp, chilly field in the year 1200. The oxen strain against their yokes, pulling the plow through thick clay soil. The furrows are uneven, the air smells of wet earth, and the farmer's wooden shoes are caked in mud. The seed bag slung over his shoulder is heavy, but not heavy. Enough he knows already, it will not cover as much ground as he'd like. Yet he scatters the rye with a practiced motion, trusting that, by autumn, the dark bread it produces will keep his family alive through the long, cold winter. But how did medieval farmers develop these resilient practices in the first place? And how did rye, of all grains, come to dominate the diets of those living in such forbidding climates? Chapter 2. From Ancient Seeds to Medieval Fields. To understand why rye became the grain of choice for farmers living on the edges of Europe's cold and unforgiving landscapes, you must trace its story further back long before the medieval. Villagers of Saxony or Scandinavia scattered seed over muddy fields. The plant itself was once considered little more than a weed. It did not begin its life in human agriculture as a celebrated crop, but as a persistent intruder. Archaeologists suggest that rye first appeared in the Near East, the same region that gave humanity wheat and barley. When Neolithic farmers planted wheat, rye often grew alongside it, sprouting from the margins of cultivated plots. It was taller, leaner, and more tolerant of poor soils. But for early farmers in warm regions, it seemed inferior. Its bread was darker, its stalks coarser. So it lingered not as a crop in its own right, but as an uninvited guest. Over centuries, however, as farming spread north and west into the colder lands of Central Europe, the very qualities that once made rye unremarkable suddenly made it indispensable. By the time of the Roman Empire, writers such as Pliny the Elder noted rye's presence, though with a tone of disdain. He described it as poor man's grain, fit for survival but hardly worthy of Roman taste. And yet, in the borderlands of the empire, places like Germania and Gaul, farmers cultivated it deliberately. They had discovered what Mediterranean elites could not see. Rye survived where wheat and barley often failed. Its resilience was not glamorous, but it was steady. And in farming communities, steady meant survival. When the Roman Empire receded, leaving behind fragmented kingdoms and self-sufficient villages, rye remained. In the early medieval centuries, it spread even further north and east, carried not by merchants, but by necessity. By the year 1000, rye had become firmly established across much of northern Europe. The chronicles of monasteries mention it frequently, not in praise, but in routine. It was the grain baked daily, brewed occasionally, and stored in barns against the cold. The spread of rye also reveals something about medieval farmers themselves. They were not passive victims of climate, but active experimenters. Every autumn, when seed was sown, a kind of trial took place. Some fields bore wheat, others barley, still others rye. When one crop failed, another might succeed. Over generations, patterns emerged. Rye survived more consistently in the harshest soils and the shortest summers. Farmers began to allocate more land to it. Its reputation grew not from sudden discovery, but from centuries of trial, error, and stubborn persistence. Cultivation practices themselves reveal another layer of adaptation. Medieval farmers learned that rye thrived when sown before winter. This practice, called winter rye, meant scattering seed in the autumn when the soil was still workable. The seedlings would sprout, tender and green, then rest under snow. When the thaw came in spring, they were ready to resume growth immediately, ahead of other grains. This gave them a crucial advantage in short growing seasons. By early summer, when villagers desperately needed food, rye was already ripening. The rhythm of rye cultivation also shaped village life. In many places, communities organized their calendar around its sowing and harvest. Church festivals aligned with these tasks, giving spiritual weight to agricultural cycles. In Saxony, for example, Autumn Saints' Days marked the time for sowing, while midsummer celebrations coincided with the first loaves of new rye bread. It was not only food but a kind of timekeeper, structuring both labor and ritual. The bread itself, though plain, carried cultural significance. In many regions, rye bread became so common that the very word for bread meant rye unless otherwise specified. In German, Brot usually referred to rye bread. Wheat bread had to be marked separately, often as Weibrot, white bread. This linguistic habit reveals the hierarchy of grain. Wheat was rare, a luxury often reserved for feasts or the tables of lords, while rye sustained the everyday life of peasants. Eating wheat daily was unimaginable for most families. Eating rye was unavoidable, but rye was not consumed only as bread. In Scandinavia, flatbreads made from rye were dried and stored for months. Hard and dense, they could be stacked in piles, almost like shingles. When food was scarce in late winter, a family might turn to these stores, soaking the bread in broth or milk to soften it. In Slavic regions, rye was also brewed into kvass, a mildly fermented drink that offered both nutrition and refreshment. In parts of northern Germany, it even served as fodder for animals when other feeds ran short. The versatility of rye, then, was not just agricultural but culinary. Yet, the reliance on rye also exposed communities to risk. The fungus ergot was not unknown to medieval people. They gave it names, feared its outbreaks, and recognized its effects, but they did not understand its biology. In years of damp weather, entire harvests could be tainted. When baked into bread, the ergot could cause madness, hallucinations, or gangrene in fingers and toes. Medieval chronicles describe outbreaks of St. Anthony's fire, a condition so named because victims were often cared for by the Order of St. Anthony, whose hospitals specialized in the disease. What did farmers do in response? They developed a kind of practical vigilance. Some tried to separate the darkest, most obviously swollen grains from their stores. Others shifted to brewing beer in bad years, as the malting process sometimes reduced contamination. But for the most part, they endured. The risks of ergot were real, but the risks of hunger were greater. And so rye remained dangerous yet necessary, feared yet indispensable, beyond rye. The farming systems themselves reveal the depth of medieval adaptation to climate. The open field system, already mentioned, spread widely in northern Europe. Fields were divided into long strips, some sown with rye, some with barley or oats, others left fallow. This rotation was not arbitrary. By alternating crops in fallow years, farmers gave soil time to recover. Livestock grazed the fallow, depositing manure that enriched the earth. Over time, this created a cycle that sustained fertility in places where soil was naturally poor. Manure itself was a kind of currency. Households with more animals could fertilize more fields, increasing yields. Villages often regulated grazing rights carefully, knowing that too many animals would deplete common pastures. In this sense, survival in cold climates was not just about individual families, but about collective management of land. The community's survival depended on shared rules, cooperation, and the steady rhythm of planting and harvesting. It is also worth noting how little surplus most villages had. The image of overflowing granaries is misleading. In reality, stores were carefully measured. Families rationed grain across the winter, stretching loaves to last until the next harvest. The months before the new crop ripened were especially dangerous. Known as the Hungry Gap, this period tested every household's resilience. Dried fish, salted meat, turnips, and hard rye bread filled the gap, but always barely. In cold years, famine loomed close, and yet, despite all these hardships, medieval farmers kept sowing rye. They kept returning to the fields each autumn, trusting that the crop that once grew as a weed in other lands would continue to sustain them. The persistence of rye, both as a plant and as a cultural staple, mirrors the persistence of the people themselves. To live in cold climates required not only strength of body, but strength of habit, a willingness to do the same work again and again, with no guarantee of success. So when you consider the medieval field muddy, cold, filled with the stooped figures of peasants scattering seed, you are not just seeing agriculture. You are seeing centuries of adaptation, trial and error, and the gradual shaping of both land and culture around a grain that demanded little but gave much. Still, one question lingers. Was rye truly enough to sustain entire populations through centuries of cold, or did its limitations push farmers to search for new methods, new crops, and new strategies to survive the harshness of the medieval North? Chapter 3. The bread that held a civilization. Rye may have been reliable, but it was not sufficient. Medieval farmers understood this more keenly than anyone. To survive in cold climates, no single crop could guarantee safety from hunger. Rye. Bread filled the table most days, but variety small, though it was mattered. Without barley for brewing, oats for porridge, beans for protein, or turnips and cabbages for winter meals, even rye could not keep a family alive. Thus, the persistence of rye must be understood not in isolation, but as part of a wider survival strategy, one that reveals how medieval communities coped with the limits of their environment. The open field system provided a structure for this strategy. As villages spread across northern Europe, they divided their fields into three great parts. One section was sown with rye or wheat, another with barley, oats, or legumes, and the third was left fallow to recover. This three-field rotation, though simple in design, doubled yields compared to earlier two-field systems, which had left half the land fallow each year. By spreading risk across different crops and staggering planting times, farmers reduced the chance of total failure. If rye succumbed to ergot, oats might survive. If barley withered, beans might still offer food. Still, even this careful system was vulnerable. In years of extreme cold or heavy rain, all crops might suffer together. Famines were not rare. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, Northern Europe endured dozens of regional shortages. Some left only scattered records. Others scarred entire generations. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 stands out. Torrential rains ruined harvests year after year, making even hardy rye rot in the fields. Grain prices soared, livestock starved, and entire villages reported hunger deaths. Chroniclers wrote of people eating cats, dogs, or bark to survive. In such times, the limits of rye were clear. It could resist frost, but it could not grow without sun. In the face of such crises, medieval farmers experimented further. They turned to root crops like turnips and parsnips, which could be stored in cellars or left in the ground through winter. They cultivated cabbages, which withstood frost better than leafy greens. In Scandinavia, fish became a staple complement to bread, salted and dried for long-term storage. In parts of Russia and Poland, millet continued to be grown, offering yet another grain for porridge or beer. These additions did not replace rye, but they balanced its shortcomings. Livestock also played a crucial role. Cows and goats provided milk, which could be made into butter and cheese, important sources of fat and protein when grain ran low. Sheep offered wool as well as meat. Pigs, feeding on scraps, were slaughtered in autumn, their meat salted or smoked to last through winter. The byproducts of animals, manure for fields, traction for plows, were as essential as the food they provided. Without animals, rye alone would not have been sustainable. Storage methods were another frontier of survival. Grain kept in pits risked dampness and mold. Barns protected it better but demanded constant vigilance against rodents. Archaeological digs have uncovered granaries built on raised posts, with gaps designed to keep rats from climbing. In some cases, rye was stored in sealed clay jars, layered with straw. Every method reflected trial and error, for a family's survival could hinge on whether their stores lasted until the next harvest. The cultural weight of rye should not be underestimated. Bread was not merely food, but a symbol of life. Church rituals centered on bread, not only in the Eucharist but in blessings of loaves at harvest festivals. In law, bread prices were regulated in towns, reflecting its central role in daily existence. Even in famine years, when little else could be afforded, rye bread remained the baseline expectation of sustenance. The monotony of diet did not diminish its importance, it elevated it, and yet, the reliance on rye also etched deep inequalities into medieval society. Lords demanded tithes and rents in grain. For peasants, this often meant giving up a portion of their rye harvest before feeding their own families. Monasteries collected grain as dues, storing it in vast barns that dwarfed village granaries. In hard years, peasants starved while elites feasted on white wheat bread imported from elsewhere. The contrast between dark rye bread and pale wheat loaves became a visible marker of class. To eat wheat daily was to belong to privilege. To eat rye daily was to belong to the majority. The persistence of rye also shaped trade. Surplus grain, when it existed, moved along rivers and across the Baltic Sea. The Hanseatic League, a commercial confederation of towns from Lubeck to Novgorod, thrived in part on grain trade. Rye from the fertile plains of Poland fed cities, where local harvests were insufficient. Thus, even this humble crop tied villages to wider networks of exchange. A farmer's field in Prussia might, through trade, sustain bakers in Stockholm or breweries in Hamburg. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of rye farming was the mindset it fostered: patience. Unlike wheat, which demanded richer soil, or barley, which ripened more quickly, rye was slow, steady, and stubborn. It grew where others failed, but it required faith. Sown in autumn, hidden under snow for months, it asked farmers to trust in a spring they could not yet see. Each year, they repeated the cycle, often in the face of disappointment. That repetition, that willingness to endure monotony and risk for the promise of survival, defined much of Northern Europe's agricultural life by the late medieval period. Rye had become so deeply embedded in culture that even as new crops arrived from abroad, it held its place. Potatoes, for example, would not spread widely in Europe until centuries later, after being brought from the Americas. In the medieval world, rye remained unrivaled as the bread of common people. Only in the modern era would it gradually give way to wheat, as industrial farming and global trade expanded diets. Yet in many regions, parts of Scandinavia, Russia, and Eastern Germany, rye bread endures as a cultural staple even today, a quiet echo of medieval survival strategies. To look back at those medieval fields, then, is to see more than simple farming. It is to see a story of resilience. The persistence of rye was the persistence of people, ordinary villagers, nameless in chronicles, who bent their backs over muddy soil year after year. They lacked the luxuries of lords, the wealth of merchants, the power of kings. But their steady work made castles possible, fed armies, sustained monasteries, and built the foundation of European society. Without rye, the North might have remained sparsely settled, its people too fragile to endure. With rye, they survived, multiplied, and endured centuries of cold. And yet, there remains a quiet irony. The very grain that sustained millions also brought suffering through ergot poisoning, monotony, and hunger when it failed. Survival came at a cost, one borne silently by those who had no choice but to eat what grew in their fields. So when you picture medieval Europe, do not begin with knights or cathedrals. Begin with a loaf of dark rye bread on a wooden table. It is there, in that plain and heavy bread, that the resilience of an age is most clearly tasted. But this raises a larger question. If rye was the grain of survival in Northern Europe, what other quiet innovations did medieval farmers develop in freezing climates, shaping landscapes and societies in ways that are still visible today? If you've drifted off or simply enjoyed this quiet journey through history, I hope it brought you a little rest. Here on Quiet Boring Sleep, we share slow, calm stories to ease the mind and settle you into sleep. If you'd like more of these gentle histories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this little corner of calm continue to grow, and it means you'll always have a quiet story waiting whenever you need it. Thank you for being here, and may your night be peaceful. Good night.